All right. So I wanted to make this quick video. Actually, it's not going to be quick at all. It's going to be a little bit long. But I I sort of enjoy hearing what everyone thinks the difference between a designer and an artist is. I have the pleasure of hearing from a lot of students why they chose to study in this industry. And many of them, particularly young undergraduates, say, I always enjoyed art, so design felt like a natural path or something to that effect. However, I'm here to tell you, and perhaps you already know, that design is incredibly technical. And as designers, we hold a responsibility not only to the organizations and companies that you all will ultimately go on to work for, but also, and more importantly, to the people for whom we are designing for. Our work has very real implications and very real consequences that we will constantly be weighing out in our considerations to ultimately produce whatever it is that we're designing. So, I always like to start with getting an understanding for what you think graphic design is. It's a little bit hard to see. There's a question down in the bottom left-hand corner there. It says, "What is graphic design?" Um, so tell me, what do you think graphic design is? Take a second and throw it into the Slack channel for the class. And while you do that, I'm actually going to show a quick video.
When people think of design, they often think an elegant chair, a well-turned logo, dramatic architecture. But that isn't all that design is. Design is more. It's more than the drapes or the drop shadows, more than a beautiful UI or a rad concept car. Design is more than aesthetics, much more. Design is fundamental. It's the predilection to investigate and understand. It's the compulsion to give form to ideas and make sense of disorder. Design is the ability to amend the imperfect. Design is knowing what questions to ask and how to ask them. What's the right problem to solve? How do I solve it? Why should I solve it?
All right. That actually didn't work as well as I had thought it would. Let me try this. Yeah, okay. YouTube won't let me share the video through Slack. So, or I'm sorry, through Zoom. So I'll just switch back over here. There we go. All right. So hopefully you took some time to add that to the Slack channel. However, I want to take a look at a couple of definitions because the International Council of Design describes design as the study and practice of the interaction between a person, generally some sort of end user, and the man made environment, accounting for aesthetic, functional, contextual, cultural, and societal considerations. So, to summarize ICD, sort of conveys that design is somewhat of a bridge for us humans to interact a little bit more comfortably with the collection of items that we use on a daily basis, be that a more visually pleasing, more usable, more clear, or more socially equitable sort of comfort. Now, ICD's description is a little bit abstract, so let's take a look at Wikipedia's definition. And I know what you're going to say. Every teacher I've ever heard from has said that Wikipedia is not a reliable source, but I think for definitions, it's a good place to start. Wikipedia says that graphic design is a profession, academic discipline, and applied art whose activity consists of crafting visual communications intended to transmit specific messages to social groups with specific objectives. This is sort of the first definition we've looked at that defines design as an actual profession, implying there's money to be made here. There's commerce to exchange and a technical skill to be had. But it also defines design as a form of visual communication with an intended audience and an intended objective. Maybe that objective is to help those encountering our designs to make an action like purchasing something from us or walking in a specific direction. Maybe the goal is to make the audience react with a certain emotion like sadness, excitement, or relaxation. Or perhaps the goal is to allow someone to complete a task more clearly or efficiently, or on the other hand, maybe less clearly and less efficiently. Robin Matthews states design is where science and art break even. That's a little bit new and pretty bold. Now we're saying that design and art are cohabitant. They exist together peacefully. This also explains why you all are here receiving a bachelor's or a master's of science rather than a master or bachelor's of art. There's a big difference there. Science suggests there's a methodology, there's a hypothesis to be validated or invalidated, and therefore a way to measure those results. As designers, how do we know if we did our job correctly? If you went over to the Herberger School here at ASU, they might tell you something like, if the client signed off, your job is done. But here at the Fulton schools, you have to prove that the work was done correctly by showing the quantifiable data, the measurements of that success, along with the scientific methodology you use to achieve those results. We can meet with the client, establish goals, and agree upon a methodology and a set of tools that we both believe will sufficiently gather the data needed to effectively measure the results of our work. Then we can sort of evaluate that data and refer back to the goals that we established to determine if we did or did not meet our predetermined goals. That's what makes this scientific. It's very black and white. Um, Again, I'm rambling on about what is design. Ultimately, to get us to this point, as designers, it's our job to make the user's interaction with the environment more natural and complete. Coming back to this statement for just a moment, we've all heard the phrase art is subjective or art is in the eye of the beholder. All of these are true statements. But on the flip side of that, science is ideally objective. It is fact. And in an ideal world, science cannot be argued with, right? For anyone who has worked with a real design client, you may have heard them say something along the lines of maybe they nitpicked the color, or maybe they didn't like a font choice, or the way the composition is laid out. This type of thing happens all the time. And that's because in those situations, you have somewhat created a space for subjectivity, and the client believes that that is a space to insert their opinion. Now, we said science and art cohabitate and they exist together, but how can that be so if their outcomes are literal antonyms of each other, right? On one hand, science is evaluated and analyzed with tools. But on the other hand, art is interpreted differently at different times by different audiences. So if you bring those two hands together, design on the whole remains relatively subjective. But there are a few things we can do that help eliminate a bit of that subjectivity. This way, designers aren't simply trying to Jackson Pollock paint splash their way toward completing a design. Some of those things can still remain somewhat subjective. Color is a little bit different. It's much less subjective because there are very clear meanings to color and color psychology, and ultimately color can in fact be measured. No design decision should be made solely based on because it's my favorite color. Color should always be an objective decision. But color theory is also its own subcategory that could be sort of its own class, really. But make sure to throw color metrology on your iPods for next semester if you want to learn a little bit more about that, because we can go into much deeper analysis on color. But what are elements, principles, and semiotics? Those are really where we want to start here. Elements are the tools by which designers evaluate, analyze, and create designs. I'll have a list for you at the end, but this would include things like color, line, value, space, shape, form, and texture. We'll explore each of those in greater detail as we go into the module a little bit deeper, and you'll have plenty of exercises to ensure that you're familiar with all 7 of those elements. But in summary, design elements are the basic building blocks of any composition. Every design out there will use one or more of those 7 design elements, not to be confused with design principles, which are how designers ultimately use those elements of design within their greater work. There are 6 design principles: unity, balance, hierarchy, proportion, emphasis, and contrast. Again, I'll have a slide for you at the end with all of those listed out. Those design principles are almost universally accepted as a set of rules and techniques for composing those 7 various design elements. So, recapping, design elements are the building blocks designers use, and principles are how we assemble those elements to create a composition. Now, semiotics is an understanding of how humans interpret and understand visual communications through signs, patterns, and symbols. In other words, semiotics is an understanding for how we can leverage those design elements and principles to effectively communicate our message through visuals alone. And as promised, here's those lists of design elements and principles for your reference. Notate them, recite them, memorize them, but above all, do not confuse them. Okay. Give me one moment. I'm going to switch my lecture really quick so that we can continue the topic. This time, we're actually going to start looking at design elements and principles. So here we go. Boom. All right. Hopefully you can see that. Let me get back up to the top of the slide here. There we go. All right, so picking up where we left off, let's take a look at 4 of what I would consider the 4 easiest design elements and see how they can be used by the masters of design in a group of their sample work. Now, I say the 4 easiest design elements simply because they are, for the most part, with the exception of form, elementary level tools. But let's go a little bit deeper so that we can understand on a more divergent scale how effectively leveraging these elements can improve the work that we produce as designers. Starting with line. This is your opportunity to make your high school geometry teacher proud. Can anyone tell me what line is? If you know the answer to this, throw it in the group Slack channel. Simple question. It really only gets harder from here. A line is the way 2 points in space are connected. Pretty simple. Hopefully nothing new here. Now, how can we use lines to aid our work? Lines can help to direct the eye toward a certain point in your composition. Taking a look at these 2 examples from the Bauhaus, where does your eye go? There's a number of principles aiding these designs. So note that lines aren't going, they're not doing all the work here, right? Lines aren't the only thing that's happening. But really, in this example on the left, you've got this big red circle, and then you've got a bunch of lines leading you up towards the top of the page. And then your eye probably comes down to the next set of lines, leading you down into Weimar and July, September 1923. The poster on the right, you're probably starting with that big red block and then sort of following the zigzag line up to the top to the next red block, down into the blue circle, and then sort of starting the process all over again. Now, these thick line poster series are an example by Aaron Draplin, who's another designer. These are a really great example of how lines can be really the entire composition rather than just an element of the composition. And if you've used Illustrator before, you kind of understand how this works. These aren't just shapes. In fact, none of them are really shapes. They're all just lines with a really heavy stroke. That's it. Line is heavily used in things like henna as a form of temporary skin decoration and is applied in a variety of spiritual and ritualistic circumstances, such as during Hindu and Muslim weddings in South Asia and during festivals and celebrations such as Diwali and Eid. You even see translations of this in real tattoos. Additionally, cornrows, traditionally called colis or irandidi in Yoruba, are often nicknamed Didi braids in the Nigerian diaspora sort of dialect. They are considered a protective styling as they allow for easy and restorative growth. Also, these are using line as their primary driving composition, right? They work to create some very intricate hair patterns sometimes. All right, time to get a little bit harder. Can anyone maybe tell me in the Slack channel what types of shapes there are? Not what shape is, but what the various types of shapes there are. I'll give you a hint. There's 3 of them. Take a moment, pause the video, add that to the Slack channel. So shapes can be either organic, geometric, or abstract. So for example, Moser's cover art of Versanctum shows how very organic shapes can be used to create imagery, but can also find their way into things like letter forms and typography, a piece considered to be the principle of Art Nouveau style, not to be confused with its more geometric successor, like geometric Art Nouveau, or even further down the line, Art Deco, but which all eliminated organic shapes in favor of a more geometric look. This constructivist poster by Eli Lazinski illustrates how you can communicate an idea through shape alone. This was a Bolshevik propaganda poster designed to encourage the Bolsheviks, also known as the Reds, to beat the monarchy, the whites. And you can kind of sort of see that very literally as the red triangle sort of penetrating into the whites and beating it, right? This poster was created to generate a little bit of positive publicity for Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits album, which was coming out shortly after he was in a motorcycle accident in 1966. The accident left him bedridden, and Bob Dylan was even rumored to be dead. Milton Glaser was commissioned to design this poster with its swirling streams of color evoking the visual effects of, at the time, very popular psychedelic drugs that were gaining popularity amongst the members of the counterculture movement. But beyond that, this poster is a really great example of how layering abstract forms and shapes can create an incredibly recognizable silhouette or image or just a recognizable shape. Again, getting incrementally harder here. Anyone who can maybe tell me what they think space is? Again, throw it in the Slack channel. There's 2 different ways that you can look at this. Space in 3D refers to the area around, above, below, or behind objects. Space in 2D simply is mostly referring to the area around, above, and below shapes or forms. So just be careful with that. When designers talk about space, we often use the language ground, positive space, negative space, and then we also have white or blank space to help identify the various different types of space that we're talking about. I try to be a little bit careful about using the term white space. I generally prefer to use the term blank space just to be a little bit mindful of our colonial heritage sometimes, particularly in the US. The ground is not in reference to the floor or the dirt outside, but rather the ground is the page or the surface or the area in which a design is placed. It is possible for the ground to change. So, for example, designing on a piece of white paper is the easiest and probably the most familiar for us to understand. But the way we design something might change if that paper is now dark green or dark blue or black, right? Now the ground is in reverse. It is darker than the text that will ultimately need to go on it. And we may need to design our text using white or white ink, for example. You may also hear the ground called the frame or artboard, particularly in softwares. However, the same verbiage has made its way into being used in lieu of ground when you are simply communicating with other designers. And this can sometimes be a generational thing as well. But for the most part, Adobe software will almost always call their ground an artboard, and Figma will call theirs a frame. Positive space is an area where objects are placed on the ground. So for example, right now, my presentation, the white background is my ground, and the everything that's in maroon is considered to be positive space. The icons on the top right, the highlight at the top, along with all of the other text elements, that would all be positive space, whereas the white is the ground. White space, or better yet, blank space, would be any of the areas where objects are not placed. So in this example, everything in maroon would be considered to be white space or blank space. And then everything, negative space is a little bit of a hard one to understand, and it often gets misused as white space. But negative space would be any areas of white space in a design that form an object itself. So here, the areas between the text in maroon are negative spaces because those negative spaces help form each of the words as a whole. This Bauhaus poster announcing an exhibition of Bauhaus work shows how space can create form. If you look at it a little bit closer, it actually looks like a face. You've got the red eye and then sort of the flat front of the face with the blue, and then the nose and the mouth kind of stick in a little bit, and then it goes down into a neck. The use of space can create some really significant emphasis and impact. In this piece, the pink triangle is reference to the Nazi persecution of LGBTQ people in the 1930s and 40s. Queer people interned at death camps had upside down pink triangles sewn onto their uniforms. Therefore, by simply inverting that triangle, it sort of symbolizes the LGBTQ community uprising against US government's silence on AIDS by sort of pulling from the past and leveraging that as a modern symbol. Similar to how the Nazis during World War II leveraged the swastika from the Persians and the Hindus and the Buddhists and many other Asian cultures, but they transformed its meaning into, originally a swastika meant health and luck and success and prosperity. The Nazis sort of turned it into a symbol of militarized hatred. So it sort of shows how the meaning of symbols can sort of change over time, and so can all of that be done through the use of shape and space. Here, designer David Carson has used the space in, around, and between letter forms and passages of copy to create a sense of irreverence or disconnection to the content. You almost don't even want to read it, but it also makes you actively want to decipher the meaning of what the content is and engage with it just a little bit more closely. What is the meaning when the designer has sort of belligerently and intentionally made it harder to read by inverting the text or overtyping that text to overtly obscuring that text? Like a magician, the goal of this design is to disorient and distract while simultaneously making you feel like you're paying somewhat close attention. Each time you look at this, it sort of reveals a little bit more of its secret. Moving on to form. Any guesses what form is? Take a moment, pause the video, throw it in the Slack channel. Form is the way that sort of an object or shape occupies space. So for example, in this poster, the word seduction has a very distinct and almost architectural form. But also, as the viewer, we get a sense that the form of the letters are also trying to seduce us a little bit. In some cases, we might even be designing a form that will ultimately be applied to another form. Sometimes the form can somewhat change the meaning. So for example, this work by Zach Minich It's not what you say, it's how you say it. Typesets phrases from rap music with Hershey's Kisses to sort of communicate the intent behind the message. That this is a compliment, despite the language itself being somewhat vulgar. In case you're having a hard time reading this, it says, "She's the illest bitch alive." This is sort of a side view of that where you can actually see that it's made out of Hershey's Kisses. But again, while the language is somewhat vulgar, the affect of the phrase, "she's the illest bitch alive," is actually a compliment, right? So we're saying it with kisses because we're complimenting you, even though the language might be a little bit vulgar. All right. I'm going to switch over again. Give me one moment. Now, let me make sure I'm in the right spot here. Yeah. Now we're actually going to continue with the design elements just a little bit more. I recognize y'all are probably a little bit tired, but I want to keep the ball rolling here. Let's go on to color. Color is a phenomenon of light or visual perception. As humans, we use this phenomenon to help us differentiate between objects that are otherwise somewhat identical. Color can be used to portray mood, light, depth, even sometimes point of view. Color can also be used to depict and describe a subject. As designers, it is essential that we understand the proper language to use when talking about color so that we can communicate with specificity and accuracy. Nothing is worse than a client saying, we can't, or better yet, nothing's worse than a client saying, "Can we make the color pop?" Right? Sort of leaving you to guess whether that means they want a darker shade of the color or a deeper saturation. So having the proper language means that you can also help clients better communicate with you. Color can be used to, hang on a sec. There we go. We can also start talking a little bit about color value. Color value refers to the lightness or darkness of a color. Something really important here is that value is not vividness or the intensity of that color. Hue is largely what defines or makes up any individual color. So, for example, red is a hue, orange is a hue, and blue is a hue. And then a tint is when you take a color and add white or increase the brightness of a color or reduce the saturation of that color. A tone would be if you are adding gray or decreasing the brightness of that color. And then a shade would be if you added black or decreased the brightness or increased the saturation of a color. Now, something important to point out is that color theory is sort of the guidelines for mixing, combining, and manipulating colors. For the most part, color theory has been a little bit debunked because of the way the meaning of color changes based on time and specific cultures. For example, red in the West, like the US and most parts of Europe, means danger, excitement, urgency, and love. Meanwhile, in the East, like Asia and some parts of India, Japan, things like that, red might mean something totally different, like purity or luck and happiness, totally different from what we believe it to mean here in the West. For example, blue in the West also means authority, loyalty, safety, trust, whereas in the East it means immorality, spirituality, divine joy, heaven, things like that. For example, purple in the West means wealth, royalty, imagination, mystery, whereas in the East it means wisdom, spirituality, awareness, and growth. And believe it or not, this is why a lot of times, pay attention the next time you go to Vegas. Pay attention to what color is most used. It's oftentimes blue and purple. And the reason for that, mostly purple, is because of that association to wealth, royalty, wisdom, awareness. That's what those casinos want you to think while you're there. So they're using color psychology to sort of manipulate you into thinking you're wealthy or royal, or that you have some sort of wisdom or spirituality that is going to help you as you gamble. But where color theory actually does work a little bit, and work pretty well is when it comes to color schemes. So primary colors, which include red, yellow, and blue for most color palettes, most practical color palettes. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between practical and digital color palettes. Um, Primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. Secondary colors are generally purple, orange, and green. And then complementary colors like blue and orange, purple and yellow, red and green. Those are all very complementary colors. But even this color wheel and color system by nature is somewhat a little bit flawed because it's not based on the reality of the way our eyes actually see color. So our eyes see color by reflecting light off of a surface. And so visible color actually looks a little bit more like this. And then our primary colors are no longer that neat sort of triadic relationship. It's sort of a split triadic where you have red up in the top, yellow off to the side a little bit, and then blue sort of complementary to red. And then our complements, sort of as I already mentioned, are no longer directly across the color wheel from one another, which is why most complementary colors actually are more of a split complement in that they complement more than just the colors across or directly across from them. Which is why most complementary colors are actually more of a split complement in that they complement more than just the colors directly across from each color. Talking a little bit about color models now. A color model is really just a system for defining and describing colors. And there are a couple of different ways that we can do this, starting with the additive color process, meaning that it creates colors by mixing light. It mixes light because it uses light from a light source, something kind of like a TV or a smartphone or a screen or a computer display to generate the color, right? Because of this result of combining the three primary colors in the RGB color model, which is what our screens use, they have individual pixels, and each pixel is a color or combination of red light, green light, and blue light, right? So because of the result of combining those three primary colors in the RGB color model, the end result of all of those colors at one time is actually white, not black. So it's a little bit confusing because we call this the additive color model, but ultimately you end up with white. So a good way to keep that on track is that white is the addition of all color, black is the lack of all color. But I'm going to really mess that up for you in a moment. So try not to keep that sunk in your head too deep. It is important to note that even though RGB is only one color model, this color model assigns numerical values to a color the way that the color looks can change depending on the device and its sort of internal color settings and the quality of that display. So even though you may specify this color, that color may change slightly depending on the device that's being used. So color may not be totally accurate on digital devices is really what I'm trying to say. The next color model that we're going to look at is a subtractive color process, meaning that it creates colors by blocking light. It blocks light because the ink absorbs the light that would typically reflect off the page, resulting in the color that we ultimately see. And this is what we would call a CMYK color model. Because of this result of combining the three primary colors in the CMYK color model and because that ultimately results in black, in theory, mixing, sort of in theory, mixing cyan, magenta, and yellow should result in black, but it's not quite black. Instead, it's a very dark brown, sort of grayish color. It's really ugly, which is why there is sort of a need for a black in this color model, which is the K here. And that K stands for key. It's sort of what we would call a key black. It's a very flat black versus if you add all of those colors plus a key black, you end up with what's called a rich black. So again, watch out for that. Fun fact, in CMYK, it is called K because in traditional offset printing, it uses the key color or the black color here for referencing the key plate, which is the plate in offset printing that holds all of the out of register information like crop marks, trim marks, and any registration marks. If you want to know a little bit more about that, take my packaging design and engineering class. We go over all of that. And then you have hex. Hex is short for hexadecimal. So aptly named because the system uses 6-digit numbers to identify colors, which essentially amounts to a shorthand for its RGB color values with a little bit of conversion gymnastics happening there. Though the origin of hex counting goes all the way back to, I don't know, 700 AD, the real birth of hex as a color model, though not exactly known, was likely developed around the time of the computer program, but certainly before the 1990s. In the 1990s, displays were only capable of showing 256 colors. And so concerted efforts were made to identify color hex codes that would quantify a standard color palette. And the result was ultimately the 216 web safe colors that we know today that were super important at the dawn of the internet, but aren't as important in the era of much more capable HD displays in our pockets that can generate every color on the visible spectrum for the most part. Hex is, again, short for hexadecimal. You end up with these codes that really spell out RGB. So I'll give you an example here. You've got R, G, and B, right? So the first 2 digits stand for red, the second 2 digits stands for green, and the last 2 digits stand for blue. And you can actually get really good at this. There are 2 sets of hex codes. You have 1 through 6, and then A through F. And if you get really good at it, you can actually start seeing how the colors, how the patterns work, and you can use those and you can sort of write your own hex codes. I used to be able to do it. I'm not so great now. Moving on a little bit, we'll talk about PMS or Pantone Matching System. This sort of began in New Jersey in the 1950s by brothers Mervyn and Jesse Levine. Both of them were advertising executives at the time who also ran a commercial printing company. In 1956, the brothers hired a Hofstra University grad. His name was Lawrence Herbert as a part-time employee. And between 1956 and 1962, Herbert used his chemistry background to systematize and simplify the company's stock of pigments and production of colored inks, resulting in what we now know as the Pantone matching system. Since then, Pantone chips have become synonymous with color and its applications. And since the Pantone chips have become synonymous with color and its applications, can anyone guess what this last color is here? Yeah, it's Coca-Cola Red. Pretty easy one. All right, so let's talk about our last element here, which is texture. Texture is the imagined feel of an object or shape. Texture can be used to elevate a design experience, elicit a specific response, or even repel users away so that they don't want to interact with something. There's a concept called hostile architecture that uses texture as a means of repelling people from like laying on park benches and things like that. But as designers, we can use a very similar approach to either attract or repel users. Braille is the most common example of a tactile or textural design experience. This poster by Suzuki uses texture, specifically that of Braille, in both a conceptual way and a more literal way. Packaging is another great example, which uses embossing, imprint, and gold foil to elevate the tactile nature of the product. And other more conceptual examples include perhaps making typography with tactile and different mediums, like these letter forms made out of honey, or these made out of paper clips, all of which play with both texture and form. All right, that was a lot to throw at you, but those are your design elements and principles. So hopefully you enjoyed that. We'll see you back here when we get to talk a little bit, or I'm sorry, those were your design elements. We'll see you back so that we can talk about the design principles.